In this video, we will promisify the read file and write file functions, which means that we will make them so that they return promises, instead of us passing a callback functions into them. So what we want is basically a read file function that returns a promise and that only receives a file name, no callback. So let's do exactly that. So we're gonna create a read file pro function. So pro for promise, because again, it returns a promise. And then all we do is to pass in the file name and, as we were saying, return a promise. So return new promise. So we use the promise constructor here, which was introduced into the language with ES6. So before ES6, like ES5, ES4, and all the previous versions, there was no support for promises in JavaScript. But they changed that in ES6 and made the language a lot better in that regard. So regarding asynchronous JavaScript. Now this promise constructor here takes in a so-called executor function, which will get called immediately when the promise is created. And this function will take in two arguments, so resolve and reject. So resolve and reject. But for now, don't worry for them. We're going to be talking about them in a minute. For now, let's just focus on this executor function itself, because this is where we actually do all this asynchronous work. In this case, the read file work. So this is where we're going to call fs.readFile with the file name that was passed in, and then the usual callback function. Okay, so the error and data. So just like before. So keep in mind that we're not actually changing the read file function. We're simply creating a new function which behind the scenes, of course, still runs the built-in read file function, but then returns a promise so that we can use the promise instead of the callback function. Okay? So we have that read file function here, which will do its work, and when it's ready, it will come back with the data. And now this is where the resolve and the reject functions come into play, because both these arguments that are available in the executor function, they are both functions. Now calling the resolve function will basically mark the promise as successful, so as fulfilled, and return the successful value from the promise. So let's actually do that. So we call resolve with data. So whatever variable that we pass into the resolve function is what will be later available as the argument in the then method. Alright, so this data here will be the value that this promise returns to us. Okay, that probably sounds a bit confusing, right? So again, whatever we pass into this function here, into the resolve function, is the result of the premise that will be available in the then handler. Now, on the other hand, we can also mark the promise as rejected in case there was an error, okay? And we do that by calling, as you can probably guess, the reject function. So if there was an error, and this is similar to what we did before, so if there was an error here, then call the reject function. And whatever we pass into this one will be the error that is later available in the catch method. So in this one here. Okay, so let's just pass a string in here. I could not find that file. Some emoji here maybe to make it pop a bit more in our console.logs, alright? And okay, that is actually already it. So let's review this here again. So we created a new file. In there, we will pass a file name, so this argument, and all we do here is to return this promise. This promise takes in one executor function, so this one here, which is where we do our asynchronous work. In that case here, of course, that is our fs.read file. Then if we get our data in a successful way, we call the resolve function with the resolved value, and if there was an error, we call the reject function. Okay? And so let's now actually use this in practice. Read file pro. We pass in our file name. So that's this one, of course. And that's it. So this will now return a promise. And so just like before, we can then use our then method on that. Okay, and so this data argument here will be exactly what we return from the promise in case it was successful. So with this resolve. So right now our doc file here contains Labrador, and so this data here will be a Labrador. And so that is then later available in our then handler here. And of course it doesn't need to have the same name. I could also call it like result or something. It doesn't matter. All right. Okay. So let's now take all of this and actually put it here. Okay. Get rid of all of this, save it, and that will run it. Now we get that error down here. So data is not defined. That's because I changed it here to a result. So let's actually go back and change it to data, because here we have data and here we have data. And so this way I don't have to go ahead and change all of these variable names. Give it another save. And here we go. So it worked. You see, we actually got the breed, which is still Labrador, and this time from our promise. Okay, so this really worked. So our read file pro function now returns a promise, and that data here is then available on our then handler. Great, so it's already working, and we can make it a lot better, and we're going to do that. But for now, I also want to promisify this write file function here. So basically do the same as we did with the read file function. Now, if you already know a bit about Node.js, maybe you're thinking that there is actually a function in Node that will automatically promisify functions for us. But of course, I wanted to show you here how promises actually work and how we build them. And so that's why I'm doing all of this here. Okay, so I really want you to learn about promises, not just how we consume them, but also how to build them. And so that's why I'm doing it this way. So write file and as a promise. And this one actually doesn't only need the file name, but also the data that should be written to that file. But then the logic in here is quite similar. So again, we return a new promise. In there we have our executor function, which takes resolve and reject as the argument. And these are kind of standard names, so resolve and reject. You could call them whatever you really wanted, but this is kind of the standard again. Okay, so fs now write file. We pass in the file, the data, and then the callback function. And now something very similar to before. So if there was an error, then call the reject function and pass in some message there. Could not write the file, again with this emoji here to make it stand out a bit more. And in case everything worked fine, well, then just resolve. Now, we don't have any data actually to pass in here, right? So we're just gonna pass in some random string, something just like saying success, okay? So a promise doesn't always have to return a meaningful value. In this case, all we're really trying to do here is to write a file which doesn't really return a meaningful value. So we're now ready to use this promiseified function. But before we do that, let's actually implement the chaining that I was talking to you about before. So right now, we still, in fact, have callbacks inside of callbacks inside of callbacks, right? So we have this then, which has this callback, and then in there, there is another then handler, which has yet another callback in it. So that doesn't really change anything, does it? Instead, we want to chain these then handlers here. And the secret to doing that is to make each handler return a new promise. So how are we going to do that? Well, remember that this function here returns a promise. And so all we have to do is to return that promise from this first then handler. So let me show that to you. So we say return superagent.get and then the string, and that is now a promise. Okay, and then we actually close this callback function here and chain this then method right onto it. Give it a save. Now we have some error here, and that is on line 40. Let's get rid of this here. And okay, it changed the formatting here for us again. That was prettier. And then we actually already have it working down here. So why does this work again? Well, of course, this function that we created in the beginning returns a promise. So on that, we can use the then method. We then make this callback function that's in it, again, return a promise. And like that, we can then chain the next then handler on that. So this result variable here will then be the resolved value of this promise that returned from the previous handler. Okay? Make sense? Now, to take it one step further, we will go ahead and use our write file pro function here now as well. And since we want to keep chaining the then methods, we will again return that actually. So return write file pro, pass in the file name, which is this one, the data, and that's actually it. Okay, so we don't need any of this here anymore. Let's just comment it out for now. Get rid of this space here, and then on there we can chain the next then handler. So then, and remember that in here we didn't really have any meaningful resolved value. So we don't want any argument to this callback function here. All we want to do is to log this string, right? So now we can actually really get rid of this. And okay. So down here we see now that it's actually already working. And again, the trick for being able to chain all of these then methods here is to return a promise before calling each of them. So this one here obviously returns a promise here, so then we can chain the then method on it. Then this piece of code here will return a promise, and so we can use then on it. Then this piece of code will return a promise, and so we can use then on it again. Okay? So that is the secret to it. Give it a save again. And so down here we see that the breed is still Labrador. We see that this here is the link. And so let's go here and confirm that this is here indeed the same as this. And so it did successfully write the string to the text file using our promisified write file function. Okay, and then in the end, we have this error handler. And the beauty here is that for all of these chained then handlers, in the end, we simply need one single catch handler. So one function handling the errors coming from either one of the three promises. Okay, let's actually only log the error to the console. And let's try to, for example, change this file here. Actually, not the file, but I'm going to change the file name here, save it, and now we see I could not find that file. So where does that come from? It comes right up here from calling the reject function. Okay, so we have an error here because we couldn't find the file, and so we call the reject function. And that reject function will then mark this promise here. So remember, this is a promise. It will mark it as rejected, and therefore the catch function is called. And so then we log that error to the console. And the result of that is what you can see down here. Okay, let's put it back. Now it works. Now let's go into the file, create a dog that doesn't exist. And now here we have this big weird error. And that's because we're simply logging the entire error and not the error message as we were doing before. But doesn't matter. Let's give it a save here now. Put it back. And alright, so now it's all working. And we got rid of that triangular shape that we had in our code and now have a so-called flat structure of chained promises. So again, this is way easier to manage, and I hope you can start to appreciate that. And it's also more logical to think and to reason about the code like this. Now, in the next lecture, we will actually take it one step further even and make this even more readable and easier to use. So stay tuned for that.